Welcome back to Hardball. Today we learned that Pakistani officials will allow U.S. intelligence people to access to Osama bin Laden's 3 wives over there, or at the very least share the information gathered in the Pakistanis' investigation, interrogation of those people. What's the significance of Pakistan's cooperation? Joining me right now is Roger Cressy and Michael Sheehan, both of whom are terrorism analysts for NBC News. Thank you, gentlemen. What is the significance? He has 3 wives. That's sort of surprising to most people. You have 3. But are they going to cooperate?
Well, they are, and this shows that they are going to try and cooperate. But it also shows, Chris, is that the wives don't have any information that could implicate the Pakistani government in sheltering bin Laden. There's no way they would have let us talk to them unless they were confident they didn't know anything. And we shouldn't be surprised. The wives weren't going to know anything here. But it's a public way to say, hey, we're working with the Americans post-bin Laden raid.
What's the significance, Michael, of releasing the picture we're looking at right now, this sort of elderly guy with a white beard in a cold place with no heat, apparently, with a big blanket around him and a hat on, a watch cap, sort of watching with a flicker a picture of himself?
Well, Chris, I think it matters a lot. It matters to a lot of different audiences. First, let me talk about the American audience. A lot of times, terrorism analysts like to paint al-Qaeda as 10 feet tall, as a boogeyman under every rock. I think this shows bin Laden is just a feeble old man on top of a crumbling organization. Still has a lot of threat out there, but we should take it in context. Also, for his adherents, I think also it impacts upon them. They see him in this house in Pakistan, in a military town, and not out in the mountains, in the caves like he likes that footage that I was watching Al Jazeera showing him as much more virile. So I think for multiple audiences, it's a good thing.
Let me ask you about the cache of information. What's your hunch as a guy who does this for a living? What do you think we have in that bag?
I think this is great. This is great.
Michael, you first. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Roger and I both worked on these cases a lot in the past. This is great news. And from my experience, and I remember some of the big hits and takedowns we had in 2003, 2004, the information that came out of those raids, Chris, had long-time impact both on operations around the world and back in the United States, because they lead to people, to phone numbers, to the international connectivity that al-Qaeda and these movements have. And I think it's going to put tremendous pressure on the organization. We're going to see investigations and operations stemming out of this takedown of locations, phone numbers, and people for months and even years ahead.
Do you think it's possible the United States doesn't know already that Pakistan was involved in harboring this guy?
Well, I think it's possible that they don't know the individuals. So we talk about the Pakistani government. What does that mean? I don't think it was senior levels of the government consciously providing support. There could be members of the government at very low levels who were doing it. So that doesn't mean Islamabad was on top of it all. Now, to Mike's point, the mother lode here is, there's a little bit of threat information and high-value targets. The real opportunity is down the road, understanding this mosaic of how the al-Qaeda network operates, putting pieces together, and then painting a picture where we can then proactively go after the network in ways we couldn't before. That's where the real intelligence value is of this.
You guys in the field, I want to ask you first, and Michael, do you guys in the field construct like these walls, like the usual suspects? You put along a wall with all the, like they used to do in the mob, like the Elliot Ness, they'd show the different families lined up and where they met.
Oh,
absolutely.
You do that?
Absolutely. You draw those boards.
Yeah, so Mike and I will remember this. When we were in the government together, the CIA would bring link analysis charts into us when I was at the White House with names and photos of people, and we tried to understand the interrelationships. There was a lot of unknown, and the unknown was always what worried us the most.
Michael, your thoughts on that? Do you have any recollection of how they do it? Like in the mob, you always see the FBI with pictures of how they have the families figured out in New York and in Chicago and that stuff.
Oh, absolutely, Chris. When I was at NYPD, we worked with the FBI together to do these link analysis. In NYPD, we used to do it on big pieces of paper with stubby pencils, which is just as effective now. Of course, it's all computerized, and it's quicker to fill in those gaps. But just imagine a link analysis as a house with a line over to a phone number, with another line over to a person. And as investigators work these leads, put people under surveillance, put wiretaps on, legal of course, and do their operations, those networks just keep expanding, and each time there's a little node on that sheet, you run another investigation and you begin to break down the organization and penetrate it. I can tell you this is going to be very exciting for those people. Is that information, by the way, which is being shared domestically already, which is another good sign that the sharing is happening, and people are starting to run investigations here in the United States based on that information from overseas.
Yeah. Well, I'm asking you about differences now. You guys are both professionals. I don't even know if you have any politics at all. I assume you have none. It's probably a fair bet. The Republicans have been hacking the Democrats, saying they don't get it. This is a war, blah, blah, blah. They love the war terminology. And the Democrats have always sort of said, no, we got to find out how they did it in terms of methodology. But, you know, and the other was, you got to say Islamofascism 4 times a day. If you don't say it, there's something wrong with you. But when it comes to catching these guys, the lingo doesn't matter, does it? It's about using the technology of criminology, isn't it? Finding how do you make these connections.
Well,
or is there any ideological difference in the way Democrats and Republican terrorist catchers operate?
Well, ideology matters to
our ideology,
right? But in terms of the professionals, the operatives, it doesn't matter. When it comes to Al Qaeda, the difference between the Republicans and the Democrats is not that great. We both use predators. We both use special operations forces. We both use.
What's the difference?
The difference there is several things. First is you don't hear Obama talking about the war on terror because there is no war on terror. Terror is not an ideology; it's a tool. You hear him talking about the war against Al Qaeda. Number one. Number two, it is trying to change the narrative on message versus messenger, okay? If the United States is going to put out a message regarding how we defeat al-Qaeda and why choosing terrorism is counter to what we in the West and elsewhere believe is right, then we've got to have a proper messenger doing that. That's part of it. And we also got to be careful that we don't say or do things that plays into the narrative that al-Qaeda and others have been trying to perpetuate about the United States.
Yeah, your thoughts, Michael. How are they two different? I mean, don't say war on terrorism, more about focus on al-Qaeda, more going after an institution, not sort of a vague thing. And don't think about a war on a methodology. Think about a war against people using a methodology.
Well, I agree with Roger, Chris, and both of us have worked on both sides of both administrations in the White House and in other organizations. And I think he's right. At the operational level, there's very little difference. The one thing I like what this administration is doing, and I think the Bush administration overhyped the threat a little bit, and I talked about that in a book I wrote several years ago, that sometimes we just paint these guys as too big, and that plays to their narrative. Because terrorism is an instrument of the weak. They attack unarmed and innocent people because they are weak. And when we over-exaggerate their threat, we empower them. So I like the way this administration has toned this down a little bit, and this recent attack against bin Laden and his capture and these images, again, put this threat, which is serious, but in context. If we continue to hammer this organization, we can marginalize them. They're not going to go away, but we can reduce them to a nuisance rather than a significant strategic threat.
Are you worried about 9/11/11, Michael?
Of course, we always do. When I was in New York City, we worried about that every day. But the organization is being debilitated, is being dismantled, and that makes the chances of a more sophisticated attack much, much more difficult for al-Qaeda. They maybe have a one-off attack here or there, but strategically they're diminished. And this is, if we can keep the momentum going, I think we can see major progress against them in the next 3 to 5 years.
Okay, thanks, gentlemen, for coming on. Thank you. You're the best, you guys. Thank you so much, Roger Cressy and Michael Sheehan.